The air in the grand ballroom of the Metropolitan Museum of Art was thick with the scent of money, a cloying perfume of hothouse lilies and aged scotch. It clung to the velvet drapes, settled on the gilded cornices, and mingled with the hushed, predatory whispers of New York's elite. This was the Metropolitan Innovators Gala, an annual coronation where the old guard of industry anointed the new. Tonight, the crown was meant for Andre Coleman. He stood near the dais, a silent island of calm in a sea of tuxedos and sequined gowns. His suit was a custom charcoal brioni, sharp enough to cut glass, a piece of armor tailored to the precise specifications of this world. He held a flute of champagne he hadn't touched, the bubbles rising and dying like forgotten ambitions. From the outside, he was a portrait of success, Andre Coleman, the 39-year-old founder and CEO of DataForge, the cybersecurity firm that had quietly become the digital fortress for half the Fortune 500. His story was the kind the city loved to tell itself, a myth of meritocracy, of the boy from the forgotten streets of Baltimore who had stormed the castle gates. But Andre knew the truth. He was not one of them. He was a bug in their code, an anomaly they tolerated only because his genius was too profitable to ignore. A remarkable achievement. Andre? The voice was a low, gravelly purr, laced with the easy authority of inherited power. Andre turned. Richard Langford stood before him, his large frame impeccably dressed, his silver hair catching the light of the crystal chandeliers. Langford was a titan, a predator from an older, more brutal era of capitalism. His conglomerate, Langford Industries, had swallowed companies for decades, leaving behind a trail of shuttered factories and hollowed-out towns. "Richard," Andre said, his voice even, "Thank you." Langford's smile was a masterpiece of polite condescension. It did not reach his cold, blue eyes, which were conducting a swift and brutal audit of Andre's existence. "I must admit, I followed your rise with a certain curiosity. It's always fascinating to see how far ambition can take someone, even without the proper foundation." The words were spoken softly, a velvet caress that concealed a stiletto's edge. Nearby, conversations faltered, heads turned. The comment was a piece of performance art, designed for the audience of rivals and peers who now watched, their faces masks of feigned indifference. Without the proper foundation, it was a dismissal of his past, his family, his entire journey. It was a reminder that no matter how high he climbed, in their eyes, he would always be an outsider who had slipped past the gatekeepers. Andre's composure was a marvel of engineering. Not a muscle twitched in his face. He simply held Langford's gaze, his own dark eyes reflecting the ballroom's cold light. "My foundation was built on work, Richard, not inheritance. It tends to be more stable." A flicker of something annoyance, perhaps surprise, crossed Langford's face before the mask of benign superiority slipped back into place. Just then, the master of ceremonies, a television news anchor with a plastic smile, stepped to the podium. And now, the moment we've all been waiting for. His voice boomed. The 2024 Innovator of the Year Award, recognizing a visionary whose work is reshaping our digital future. This year, the honor goes to a man who has truly redefined the meaning of security, Mr. Andre Coleman. A wave of polite applause rippled through the room. Andre felt 100 pairs of eyes on him as he took a step toward the stage. The spotlights found him, washing him in a brilliant, isolating white. He was 10 feet from the steps when Langford moved. A subtle, almost imperceptible shift of his body that placed him directly in Andre's path. He placed a hand lightly on Andre's arm, a gesture that looked like a congratulatory touch, but felt like a manacle. A moment. Langford said, his voice still a low murmur. Yet it carried an undeniable command. The MC on stage faltered, glancing toward Langford with a confused, almost fearful deference. Langford leaned in close, his breath smelling of expensive whiskey. "You have to understand something, son," he whispered. The word son, a deliberate, emasculating insult. This world has rules. It has a lineage. You are a guest here, a temporary one. Don't ever forget that. Before Andre could respond, Langford stepped back, giving a slight, almost invisible shake of his head to the MC. The anchor's eyes widened in comprehension. He licked his lips, his professional veneer cracking under the pressure of a command from a true kingmaker. "My apologies." The MC stammered into the microphone, his voice strained. A slight correction on the card. An administrative error. The 2024 Innovator of the Year Award goes to Mr. Julian Croft of Croft Ventures. A stunned silence fell over the ballroom, thick and suffocating. It lasted only a second before it was broken by a confused, scattered applause for a man no one had expected to win. Andre stood frozen in the spotlight, the warmth of its beam now feeling like the heat of a branding iron. Langford had not just snubbed him. He had orchestrated a public execution. He had shown everyone in the room, everyone in their world, that he held the power to write and rewrite reality at will. He could give a crown and, just as easily, snatch it away, leaving the would-be king naked and humiliated before the entire court. Andre did not flinch. He did not look at Langford. He simply turned, his movements measured and precise, and walked back to his place by the bar. His face was a placid mask, but behind his eyes, a memory was unspooling, sharp and painful as a shard of glass. He was 10 years old again, standing on the cracked pavement of his street in Baltimore. A grim-faced sheriff was nailing an eviction notice to the front door of their small row house. His father, a proud man who had worked at the Garrison steel mill for 20 years, stood on the lawn, his shoulders slumped in a way Andre had never seen before. His mother was crying silently into her hands. The mill, the lifeblood of their community, had been bought out by a massive, faceless conglomerate. The new owners had promised investment and growth. Instead, they had liquidated the assets, bled the pension fund dry, and shuttered the factory, casting thousands of families into ruin. The name of that conglomerate echoed in his mind, a name he had first heard as a boy, spat out like a curse at the dinner table: Langford Industries. The humiliation at the gala was not random. It was not a simple act of a powerful man flexing his muscles. It was an echo, a continuation of a war that had been declared on his family decades ago. Langford hadn't just insulted Andre Coleman, the CEO. He had desecrated the memory of his father's calloused hands, his mother's sleepless nights, and the promise Andre had made to himself on that broken Baltimore sidewalk that he would never be powerless again. He picked up the untouched champagne flute. His hand was perfectly steady. The calm that enveloped him was not one of defeat. It was the chilling, absolute stillness that precedes a hurricane. The fight wasn't over. It had just been given a new, brutally public battlefield. 2 weeks later, the opulent chill of the gala had been replaced by the sterile, pressurized air of an Aero Coast Boeing 777. Andre sat in seat 2A, the window seat in the first-class cabin on a flight from Atlanta to San Francisco. He had booked it deliberately. After the gala, he'd retreated into his work, burying the fury beneath layers of code and strategy meetings. His aide, Elena Brooks, a woman whose loyalty was matched only by her ferocious intellect, had insisted he take the trip for a crucial meeting with a new investor. Fly first class. She'd said, "You've more than earned it." He hadn't seen it as a luxury. He saw it as a reclamation, a small symbolic act of occupying a space he was entitled to. The world of Data Forge was one of clean lines, brushed steel, and the quiet hum of servers processing the future. It was a world he had built, a meritocracy of logic and data where the best algorithm won, regardless of its origins. The first-class cabin was a microcosm of Langford's world, a space defined by unwritten rules, subtle hierarchies, and the quiet currency of entitlement. The pre-flight dance began. A flight attendant with a practiced smile offered him champagne. He accepted a glass of sparkling water. He needed to be sharp. He watched as the other passengers settled in, a collection of bespoke suits and designer handbags. Then, a disturbance rippled from the front of the cabin. Richard Langford boarded the plane, his voice booming as he barked into his phone. He moved with the graceless certainty of a man who believed the world was his private lounge. He ended his call, and his eyes swept the cabin, landing on the front row. The moment he saw Andre in seat 2A, the polite facade he wore in ballrooms vanished, replaced by a look of raw, undisguised contempt. "I believe you're in my seat," Langford said. It wasn't a question. It was a declaration of ownership. Andre looked up from his tablet, his expression unreadable. He gestured to the boarding pass resting on the small table beside him. 2A, my seat. "Impossible," Langford snapped, pulling out his own ticket. "I fly this route every month. I'm always in 2A. The lead flight attendant, a woman named Karen Mallister, whose name badge gleamed on her starched uniform, hurried over. Her deference to Langford was immediate and absolute. "My apologies for the inconvenience. Mr. Langford, let me see what's happened." "I booked this seat 3 weeks ago," Andre stated, his voice calm but clear, cutting through the rising tension. "I have the confirmation email right here." He held up his phone, the screen displaying the incontrovertible proof. Karen barely glanced at it. Her focus was entirely on placating Langford. "It must be a system error." "Sir, a duplicate booking." Andre's eyes narrowed. He knew perfectly well it was no error. "Is there another open seat in first class?" he asked, testing her. "Completely full, I'm afraid," she replied, her tone suggesting this was his problem to solve, not hers. Langford crossed his arms, his face flushed with indignation. "I have a bad back. I require this specific seat, the bulkhead. He can move." The entitled pronouncement hung in the air. This was the moment of decision, the point where deference to power would override rules and fairness. Andre felt the eyes of the other passengers on him. Some were annoyed at the delay. Others watched with the detached curiosity of spectators at a gladiatorial contest. "Excuse me." A woman's voice cut in from the row behind. Priya Shah, a sharp-eyed businesswoman Andre recognized from the tech world, leaned forward. "He has a ticket and a confirmation. The airline's error shouldn't be his responsibility." Karen's smile tightened. "Ma'am, we'll handle this. Please don't interfere." Langford smirked. Leaning against the seat, he lowered his voice. But it was pitched to carry to those nearby a calculated performance of passive aggression. It's admirable how far some people can get with so little grounding. But a seat like this, it implies a certain history, a certain understanding of the rules. The insult was exquisite in its cruelty, a perfect echo of his words at the gala. Andre felt the old fury, cold and sharp, rise within him. But he did not let it show. He met Langford's gaze, his own voice a precise instrument of logic. "The rules, as I understand them, are based on a paid ticket and a confirmed seat number. I have both." The cockpit door opened, and Captain Daniel O'Neill emerged, his face a mask of impatience. What's the delay? Karen. Langford seized the opportunity. He's in my seat. Captain, I'm a Diamond Tier member. I fly this route weekly. We're all being held up because he refuses to move. The captain's gaze fell on Andre. His expression already one of judgment. It was the swift, unconscious calculus of bias, a confrontation between a known, high-value customer and an unknown variable. The choice was preordained. "Let me see your documents," the captain said to Andre. His tone clipped. Andre handed them over. O'Neill gave them a cursory glance before turning to the flight attendant. "What does the manifest say?" "It shows a duplicate, Captain," Karen said, "but Mr. Langford's status gives him priority." It was a lie, a fabrication of policy on the spot, but it was the lie they needed. The captain nodded. The matter settled in his mind. "Mr. Coleman," he said, the name sounding foreign and unimportant on his lips. "I'm going to have to ask you to deplane. We can rebook you on the next flight." Not just move, deplane. It was an escalation, a punishment. "I have done nothing wrong," Andre said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous frequency. "I paid for this seat. I have a valid confirmation. This is my seat." The cabin fell into a heavy silence. This was no longer about a seating dispute. It was a raw, public display of power. Langford watched, his lips curled into a triumphant smirk. He hadn't just gotten his seat. He was getting the satisfaction of seeing Andre ejected entirely. Andre knew he had two choices. He could yield, swallow the humiliation, and allow the system to grind him down, just as it had ground down his father, or he could fight. But a loud, angry fight would only feed their narrative of him as the aggressor, the disruptive element. He needed a different weapon. With a movement so subtle no one noticed, he propped his phone against the in-flight magazine in the seat pocket in front of him. He angled it perfectly, tapped the screen, and began recording. "Captain," Andre said, his voice now imbued with an unnerving calm, "are you ordering me to leave this aircraft, despite my having a valid ticket and having committed no violation?" The captain's jaw tightened. "If you do not comply, I will be forced to consider you a security threat. We will have you removed." It was the final, irreversible move. They were invoking the language of security to enforce the hierarchy of status. "Very well," Andre said, the words falling like chips of ice into the silent cabin. He rose slowly, deliberately. He collected his tablet and slid it into his briefcase. He didn't look at Langford. He didn't look at the captain. He looked at the other passengers, his gaze sweeping over their faces, silently asking them to bear witness. Then, as he turned to leave, his eyes met Langford's. There was no anger in his expression. There was no defeat. There was only a cold, hard promise. A promise that this was not an ending, but an inciting incident. Langford may have won the seat, but he had just started a war with a man who knew, better than anyone, how to dismantle a system from the inside out. The game was on. The walk of shame down the jet bridge felt like a mile. 2 airport security officers flanked him, their presence a public declaration of his status as a problem. At the gate, the Aero Coast agent offered a rehearsed, insincere apology while avoiding his eyes. "We can get you on the 8 p.m. flight. Mr. Coleman, we'll offer you a meal voucher for the inconvenience." A meal voucher. The offering was so pitifully inadequate, it was almost comical. Andre didn't respond to her. He stepped to the side, away from the flow of late-boarding passengers, and pulled out his phone. He stopped the recording, saved the file, and made a call. "Elena," he said, his voice flat, They just removed me from the flight. Langford was on board. He orchestrated it. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Elena's mind worked as fast as his. Video. Clean. Audio is perfect. Every word. Good, she said, the fury in her voice tempered by strategic coldness. What's the play? This isn't about a refund anymore, Andre said, watching through the terminal window as the ground crew pushed Flight 1182 back from the gate. This is about immolation. I want Aerocoast to burn. I want Langford to feel the heat. Get our legal team on the line. And charter a jet. I need to be in San Francisco in 5 hours. Already on it. Elena replied, a Citation X is waiting on the private tarmac. Wheels up in 45 minutes. Walking from the chaos of the commercial terminal to the hushed, carpeted quiet of the private aviation lounge was like crossing a border into another country. Here, no one looked at him with suspicion. The staff addressed him as Mr. Coleman, their service seamless and deferential. The irony was a bitter pill. To be treated with dignity. He had to exit the system accessible to the public and enter a world reserved for the ultra-wealthy. Once airborne, soaring at 40,000 feet in the silent luxury of the private jet, Andre opened his laptop. He sent the video file to Monica Levine, Dataforge's formidable chief counsel. While he waited for her analysis, he began to type. He wasn't crafting a complaint. He was drafting a manifesto. He laid out the events of the flight with the dispassionate precision of a forensic analyst, but he framed it within the larger context of the gala, of Langford's campaign of humiliation. Monica called back within 20 minutes. It's gold, Andre. Pure gold. Their legal exposure is catastrophic. Langford's comments, the captain's threats. It's a textbook case of discrimination. You can release it, but I suggest you attach a statement. Keep it calm. Frame it as a systemic issue, not just a personal grievance. You need to be the voice of reason. Let them be the face of prejudice. Andre finalized his statement. A powerful narrative about dignity, respect, and the quiet biases that govern the spaces of power. He concluded with a simple, devastating line. This was not about a seat. It was about being told, once again, that I do not belong. Today, I am asking Aerocoast, and every corporation that operates on the same unwritten rules, to answer one question: who gets to decide who belongs? He uploaded the video and the text to his social media accounts. He attached a single, incendiary hashtag #WhoDecides. Then he closed his laptop, leaned back in the plush leather seat, and watched the sun set over the American heartland. He had dropped a match into a tanker of gasoline. Now, all he had to do was wait for the explosion. By the time he landed in San Francisco, his phone was a vibrating beacon of chaos. The video had not just gone viral, it had achieved escape velocity. It was rocketing through the digital stratosphere, shared by celebrities, politicians, and tens of thousands of ordinary people who saw their own experiences of marginalization reflected in his story. The first obstacle materialized before he even left the airport. An alert from Elena flashed on his screen, a statement from Aerocoast. He read it as his car navigated the nighttime traffic of the Bay Area. Aerocoast sincerely regrets the misunderstanding aboard Flight 1182 it began. Due to a system glitch, a seat was inadvertently double-booked. We are conducting a full review of our booking software to prevent future occurrences. We have reached out to Mr. Coleman to offer our deepest apologies and a full refund. It was a classic corporate non-apology. Blame the technology, ignore the humanity, and try to make the problem disappear with a check. Andre let out a short, harsh laugh. They were treating him like a disgruntled customer. They had no idea they were dealing with an insurgent. Almost immediately, A second line of attack began. Pro-Langford media outlets, blogs, and anonymous social media accounts started pushing a counter-narrative. Andre Coleman was an opportunist. He was a tech billionaire playing the victim card. He had a history of being difficult. They dug up a minor dispute he'd had with a vendor 5 years ago, twisting it into a pattern of aggressive behavior. It was a coordinated smear campaign, a clumsy but powerful attempt to muddy the waters and discredit the messenger. Langford was using his media connections to fight back. This was the first true test. The public humiliation was one thing. A sustained, well-funded character assassination was another. He felt a flicker of the old instinct to retreat, to focus on his work, to let the noise die down. It was the survival mechanism he had learned as a boy in Baltimore. Keep your head down, work harder, and don't give them a target. But his father's voice echoed in his memory. Not the weary man on the lawn, but the proud man at the dinner table. Stand tall, son, not with anger, but with the certainty that you belong. He called Elena. They're trying to reframe this. We need to escalate. The tech conference is tomorrow morning, she said. Your keynote. It's the perfect platform. Every major news outlet will be there. My speech is about quantum encryption, Andre said. Rewrite it, Elena countered, her voice firm. Forget quantum encryption. Right now. You are the most important story in the country. Don't talk about protecting data. Talk about protecting people. He knew she was right. He had been given a stage he never asked for. To waste it would be a betrayal of the promise he had made to his 10-year-old self. That night, in his hotel suite, overlooking the glittering expanse of the San Francisco Bay, Andre deleted his entire presentation. He opened a blank document and began to type, not as a CEO, but as a man who had finally decided that the price of silence was too high. He would not just answer their attacks. He would put the entire system on trial. The main hall of the Moscone Center was electric. What was supposed to be a standard tech industry keynote had become the most anticipated event of the year. The room was packed not just with engineers and venture capitalists, but with a throng of national media, their cameras aimed at the stage like artillery. Backstage, Andre felt a profound sense of calm. He had turned the fury into fuel, the humiliation into a weapon. When he walked onto the stage, the applause was deafening. He stood at the podium and waited for the noise to die down. Good morning, he began, his voice deep and steady, filling every corner of the vast hall. I was scheduled to speak to you today about the future of cybersecurity, but I need to talk about a more fundamental kind of security. The security of knowing that your dignity will be protected. The security of being seen as a human being. For the next 20 minutes, he held the audience captive. He didn't just recount the story of the flight. He wove it into a larger narrative about power, privilege, and the invisible architecture of bias. He spoke of the gala, of Langford's coded insults, and of the factory in Baltimore. He was connecting the dots, showing that the incident on the plane was not an isolated event, but the logical outcome of a system designed to protect its own. Aerocoast called it a system glitch, Andre said, his voice laced with irony. And, in a way, they're right. It is a glitch in the system. A system that sees a black man in first class and processes it as an error. A system where the word of a powerful man outweighs the evidence of a boarding pass. This isn't a software problem. It's a hardware problem. It's wired into the machine. As he spoke, a message from Elena popped up on the tablet built into the podium. It was a link to an internal Aerocoast email chain, forwarded by an anonymous whistleblower from within the airline. His eyes scanned the text, and the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. He looked up at the thousands of faces watching him. Then, at the bank of cameras broadcasting his words to millions. "I have just received evidence," he said, his voice ringing with cold fury. "That proves this was no accident." He projected the email onto the giant screen behind him. The first email was from Patricia West, AeroCoast's Director of Customer Relations, to the Atlanta Station Manager, Priority Flag Richard Langford. "Diamond here is on Flight 1182. He requires Seat 2A. The seat is currently occupied by a passenger named A. Coleman. Please handle this discreetly and ensure Mr. Langford's needs are met." The second was the reply from Karen Mallister. "Understood. We can call it a system error if there's any pushback. That kind of passenger rarely makes a fuss." Gasps rippled through the auditorium. The click and whir of cameras intensified. This was the smoking gun. This was proof of a deliberate, premeditated act of discrimination, orchestrated to appease a powerful man. Andre let the image hang on the screen for a long moment. "They thought I wouldn't make a fuss," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow more powerful than a shout. "They were wrong. And my message to AeroCoast, to Richard Langford, and to any corporation that believes its customers' dignity is negotiable, is this: the age of making a fuss has just begun." He walked off the stage to a standing ovation that felt like an earthquake. The ground had shifted. This was no longer just his fight. He had ignited a rebellion. In the days that followed, the story exploded. Who Decides and Boycott AeroCoast dominated social media. The airline stock plummeted, wiping out over $1 billion in market value. Corporate clients began severing ties. The CEO of AeroCoast was forced to issue a groveling, televised apology. But the damage was done. The leaked emails had transformed a public relations crisis into a full-blown existential threat. Andre, however, found no satisfaction in the airline's suffering. His target was not the hapless CEO or the flight attendants caught in the gears of the machine. His target was the man who had set those gears in motion. His target was Richard Langford. Elena was the one who found the real twist. She had been digging relentlessly, not into AeroCoast, but into Langford. She was a digital archaeologist, sifting through layers of forgotten data, looking for a connection, a reason for the personal, obsessive nature of Langford's animosity. She found it late one night, buried in the metadata of airline passenger manifests going back years. She walked into Andre's office, her face pale. It wasn't a coincidence that he was on that flight. "Andre." "What do you mean?" "I cross-referenced his private jet's tail number with commercial flight schedules. Langford was supposed to be in Zurich that day. He flew his own jet to a meeting, but 24 hours before your flight, his plane diverted from its flight path and landed in Atlanta. He booked a last-minute commercial ticket on AeroCoast Flight 1182. Your flight." Andre stared at her, the implications slowly dawning on him. "He knew I was on that plane." "It's more than that," Elena said, her voice trembling slightly. She pulled up another file, a log of phone calls made from Langford's executive office. The day before the flight, there was a 12-minute call placed directly to the private line of the CEO of AeroCoast. The world tilted on its axis. The incident at the gala, the confrontation on the plane. They weren't separate acts of arrogance. They were a coordinated campaign. Langford had seen Andre's name on the passenger list and had set a trap. He had diverted his own multi-million-dollar jet and booked a commercial flight for the sole purpose of orchestrating Andre's public humiliation. This changed everything. This was no longer a fight against a faceless system. It had become a war between two men. The vague sense of historical injustice he felt from the factory closure now sharpened into a terrifyingly specific, personal vendetta. Langford wasn't just a bigot. He was hunting him. A cold, terrifying clarity washed over Andre. His goal shifted. Justice for the public was one thing, but for Richard Langford, he needed something else. He needed revenge. Not a loud, explosive revenge, but a quiet, systematic dismantling. He would use the very tools he had created: logic, data, and an unerring eye for systemic weakness to bring Langford's entire world crashing down. He would take everything from the man who had tried to take his dignity. The hunt for Richard Langford began not in boardrooms, but in the digital catacombs of the internet and the dusty, forgotten archives of county courthouses. Andre shifted the vast resources of DataForge from defense to offense. He assembled a small, covert team, led by Elena, sworn to secrecy. Their mission was simple: to map every corner of Langford's empire, his holding companies, his offshore accounts, his political connections, his personal debts, and find the single, load-bearing pillar that, if kicked out, would bring the entire edifice down. While the world was focused on the AeroCoast scandal, Andre became a ghost. He declined interviews, turned down speaking engagements, and delegated the day-to-day operations of DataForge. He and his team worked out of a secure, off-site location. The walls of their war room covered in a complex web of diagrams and data points that tracked the flow of Langford's money and influence. The work was a descent into a world of breathtaking cynicism. Langford Industries was not just a company. It was a predator state. It acquired healthy businesses, saddled them with debt, stripped their assets, and then cast the hollowed-out carcasses aside, all while using labyrinthine tax schemes to funnel the profits offshore. The closure of the Garrison Steel Mill in Baltimore hadn't been a business failure. It had been the business model. During this deep dive, Andre started noticing a pattern, a recurring turn of phrase in Langford's internal company memos: creative accounting for foundational stability. It was an odd, almost poetic euphemism for financial fraud. The phrase struck a chord deep in his memory, a faint, discordant echo he couldn't place. Elena, meanwhile, was chasing a different thread. She had unearthed an old, microfilmed article from a Baltimore newspaper from the year the steel mill collapsed. It detailed the aftermath, the community's devastation. The article mentioned the CEO of the mill at the time of the Langford acquisition, a man named Richard Langford Sr. A sidebar noted that just weeks after the final closure, the elder Langford had died by suicide. The information landed with the force of a physical blow. Richard Langford's animosity wasn't just about class or race. It was rooted in a family tragedy he somehow connected to Andre's community, to his past. Armed with this new, unsettling context, Andre intensified his search. He knew the answer wasn't in Langford's present. It was in his past. It was in the wreckage of that steel mill. He focused his team's efforts on the financials of the Garrison Steel acquisition, a deal that was nearly 30 years old. While the digital hunt continued, Andre began his public maneuver. AeroCoast, crippled by the scandal and teetering on the edge of bankruptcy, had become the perfect prize. He began quietly buying up its stock through a series of anonymous shell corporations, his acquisitions masked by the market's volatility. He was accumulating power, piece by piece, preparing for a final, public showdown. He would use Langford's own strategy against him, acquire the weakened asset, and seize control. Langford, however, was no fool. He was a cornered animal, and cornered animals are the most dangerous. He must have sensed the shift in Andre's strategy from public advocacy to silent, focused aggression. The counterattack came suddenly and with brutal force. It started with a massive, sophisticated cyber attack on DataForge's servers. It wasn't a simple hack. It was a military-grade assault designed to steal their core intellectual property and cripple their operations. Andre's own defense systems, the best in the world, held strong, but the attack was relentless. For 72 straight hours, Andre and his top engineers lived in the server rooms, repelling wave after wave of intrusions. It was a siege, and Andre knew with chilling certainty who was laying it. Langford was trying to destroy the source of his power, his company, his life's work. Simultaneously, a second front opened. Langford leveraged his immense political influence. Suddenly, Dataforge was hit with a surprise regulatory audit from the SEC. Federal agents descended on his headquarters, demanding access to every file, every email, every line of code. It was a classic weaponization of bureaucracy, designed to paralyze his company, drain his resources, and bury him in legal paperwork. Andre was now fighting a war on two fronts. He was defending his own empire from annihilation while trying to orchestrate the downfall of another. The pressure was immense. His board of directors grew nervous. His investors started asking questions. For the first time, he felt a sliver of doubt. Was the price of this revenge too high? Was he risking everything he had built on a personal vendetta? He found his answer one night, standing alone in the war room, staring at the complex web of Langford's corruption. On the board was a photo of the shuttered Garrison steel mill, rusted and derelict. He saw his father's slumped shoulders, felt the phantom shame of the eviction notice. This wasn't just for him. It was for every family that had been broken on the altar of Langford's greed. He would not back down. He delegated the defense of Dataforge to his trusted lieutenants. He would handle the SEC audit himself, meeting their bureaucratic aggression with overwhelming, organized transparency. But his own focus remained locked on the primary objective. He had to find the source of Langford's original sin, the secret buried in the ruins of the steel mill. The breakthrough came from the most unlikely of places: a box of old, water-damaged accounting ledgers from the pre-digital era, recovered from a forgotten county storage facility. His team had been digitizing them, running the decades-old numbers through modern analysis software. One of his junior analysts, a brilliant kid fresh out of MIT, flagged an anomaly. It was a complex algorithm used to balance the books at Garrison Steel in its final years, a method of hiding debt and inflating assets that was remarkably sophisticated for its time. "This fraud scheme is almost a work of art," the analyst said, pointing to the screen. "The guy who designed this was a genius." Andre leaned closer, looking at the elegant, intricate logic of the fraudulent code. And then he saw it. A particular sequence. A unique digital signature in the way the data was structured. His blood ran cold. He knew that signature. He had written it. The memory hit him like a lightning strike. He was 19 years old, a scholarship student at Johns Hopkins, brilliant but broke. To make money, he did freelance coding projects. One of his first major gigs was for a small financial consultancy. They had hired him to build a stress-testing algorithm, a piece of software designed to find weaknesses in corporate accounting systems. It was his first masterpiece, an algorithm so effective at detecting financial fraud that it was almost prescient. He had been proud of it. He had never known who the consultancy's end client was. He now knew his first great creation, the code that had launched his career, was the very tool that had been used to expose the rot inside Garrison Steel. His algorithm had likely been the catalyst that brought the company down. That revealed the precarious, illegal practices of its CEO, Richard Langford Sr. And Langford's son had been watching. The final, devastating piece of the puzzle slammed into place. Langford's hatred was not about race, or class, or even the downfall of his family's reputation. It was biblical in its simplicity. "You destroyed my father. Now I will destroy you." Langford hadn't just been playing with him. He had been hunting the man he held responsible for his father's suicide for 20 years. And the phrase he used in his memos, creative accounting for foundational stability, it was a twisted, mocking homage to the very scheme Andre's code had unraveled. At that moment, the second, more terrible twist revealed itself. As Andre's team finished their analysis of Langford Industries' current finances, they uncovered a massive, ongoing fraud. Langford had replicated his father's sins on a global scale, but the scheme's central pillar was the Langford Industries Pension Fund, the very fund that held the retirement savings of thousands of former factory workers from Baltimore and a dozen other hollowed-out towns, including old friends of his own father. If Andre exposed the fraud to destroy Langford, the entire fund would collapse. The pension assets would be seized, and thousands of innocent people, the very people he was trying to avenge, would lose everything. Langford had laid the perfect trap to win his revenge. Andre would have to decimate his own community. His moral choice was stark and horrifying: pursue total victory and cause catastrophic collateral damage, or back down and let Langford win. He was trapped. But Andre Coleman had built his empire on finding a third way, on seeing a path where others saw only a dead end. He would not destroy the pensioners. He would save them, and he would still make Langford pay. The sky over Chicago was the color of bruised slate, a ferocious storm. Whipped into a frenzy by the lake, hurled sheets of rain against the glass skin of the Aero Coast Tower. Inside, on the 88th floor, an emergency shareholder meeting was underway. The atmosphere in the boardroom was even more turbulent than the weather outside. The room was a pressure cooker, filled with panicked investors, a grim-faced board of directors, and a handful of financial journalists who had scented blood. Aero Coast was in a death spiral. Its stock was worthless, its brand toxic. Richard Langford, smelling the kill, had called this meeting to execute his final move. He proposed a hostile takeover, offering to buy the entire airline for pennies on the dollar, absorbing its assets into his own sprawling conglomerate. It was a predator's move, a way to capitalize on the very crisis he had helped create. He stood at the head of the long mahogany table, radiating a predatory confidence. He was minutes away from victory. "The board has reviewed Mr. Langford's offer," the interim CEO said, his voice heavy with defeat. "Given our current financial situation, we see no other viable path forward. We recommend a vote to accept the acquisition." A funereal silence settled over the room. The only sounds were the drumming of the rain against the windows and the soft ticking of a large digital clock on the wall, counting down the final seconds to the vote. Then, the heavy doors to the boardroom swung open. Every head turned. Andre Coleman walked into the room. He was not on the agenda. He was not an expected guest. He moved with a quiet, deliberate grace, his presence immediately shifting the room's center of gravity. He was followed by his lawyer, Monica Levine, and two aides carrying sleek, black briefcases. A murmur of confusion and shock rippled through the investors. Langford's face, which had been a mask of triumph, hardened into a scowl of pure hatred. "What is the meaning of this?" Langford boomed, his voice echoing in the tense silence. "You have no right to be here. Coleman, this is a shareholders' meeting." "I am a shareholder." "Richard," Andre replied, his voice calm and clear. He placed a single folder on the table. "Through a consortium of holding companies, I have acquired 35% of Aero Coast's voting stock, which makes me the largest single shareholder in this room." The statement landed like a grenade. Chaos erupted. Investors shouted questions. Board members stared in disbelief. Langford looked as if he'd been struck by lightning, his face a mask of rage and confusion. "Order!" the CEO yelled, banging a gavel weakly. "Order!" When the room settled, all eyes were on Andre. He stood at the opposite end of the table from Langford. The two men locked in a silent, deadly duel across the polished wood. Mr. Langford's offer is predicated on the idea that Aerocoast is worthless, Andre began, his voice cutting through the tension. He's right. Under its current leadership, and with its current reputation, it is. But its failure wasn't just due to a PR scandal. It was a symptom of a deeper sickness, a culture of corruption that starts at the top. He looked directly at Langford. You see, Richard here has a history with this sort of thing. It's a family tradition. Andre's team opened the briefcases and began distributing dossiers to everyone at the table. On a large screen behind him, a presentation flickered to life. It wasn't about Aerocoast. It was about Langford Industries. For the past 30 years, Andre said, as charts and incriminating documents filled the screen, Langford Industries has been running one of the largest pension fraud schemes in American history. It's a work of art. Really, a modern version of a scheme first developed by his father, Richard Langford Sr., at Garrison Steel. Langford shot to his feet, his face purple with rage. These are lies, fabrications. You have no proof. Oh, but I do. Richard, Andre said softly, I have all of it. The offshore accounts, the falsified actuarial tables, the shell corporations used to siphon money from the pension fund. And I have the source code. The final piece of the presentation appeared on the screen, 2 columns of code, side by side. One was the elegant, fraudulent algorithm from the Garrison Steel ledgers. The other was the core of Langford Industries' current pension management software. They were nearly identical. You see, Andre continued, his voice resonating with the weight of decades of history. The original fraud at Garrison Steel was uncovered by a piece of software I wrote as a college student. A fraud detection algorithm. It exposed your father's crimes and led to his ruin. The truth, raw and explosive, hung in the air. The room was utterly silent. Langford stared at Andre, his breathing ragged, his eyes wide with a horrified understanding. You, Langford choked out, his voice a strangled whisper. It was you. It was always me. Andre replied, You've spent 20 years plotting revenge against a ghost. Richard. And now, the ghost has come to collect. Langford finally broke. He was my father. He screamed, his voice cracking with a grief and rage that had festered for decades. You took everything from him. From us. You destroyed my family. Your father was a thief who stole from his own workers, Andre shot back, his own voice finally rising, filled with the righteous fury of a son avenging his own father. And you are worse. You learned his sins and magnified them. You've been stealing the future from thousands of families, including the families of the men who worked alongside my father in Baltimore. This was the moment Andre had been waiting for, the moment of total destruction. He held a data stick in his hand. Everything is on this drive. One click, and it goes to the SEC, the Department of Justice, and the New York Times. Your empire will cease to exist by morning. But then he paused. He looked not at Langford, but at the other investors. However, there is a complication. If I release this information as is, the federal government will freeze all of Langford Industries' assets, including the pension fund. The fund will collapse, and thousands of retirees will be left with nothing. The very people I swore to protect would become the final victims of Langford's greed. The moral dilemma he had wrestled with was now laid bare for all to see. So, I am offering a third way, Andre announced. I have prepared a counter-proposal, a structured bankruptcy and acquisition plan. The details flashed on the screen. Andre's consortium would acquire Aerocoast. It would also assume control of the collapsing Langford Industries. Using his own personal capital and a consortium of ethical investors he had already lined up. He would personally guarantee the pension fund, making every single worker whole. The funds to do so would come from the complete, systematic, and legal liquidation of every personal asset Richard Langford owned: his houses, his jets, his art collection, his stocks. Langford will be left with nothing, Andre declared, but the people he robbed will be saved. The choice, shareholders, is yours. You can vote for his fire sale and be tainted by his collapse. Or you can vote for a new beginning, a chance to rebuild this airline into something that stands for integrity. The clock on the wall chimed, signaling the end of the voting period. The result was a foregone conclusion. The vote was unanimous. Andre had not just won, he had rewritten the terms of victory. Langford collapsed back into his chair. A broken man. The storm outside raged. But inside the boardroom, the storm had passed. Andre walked over to the window and looked down at the city lights, blurred by the rain. He had achieved his revenge, but he had done it without becoming the monster he was fighting. He had chosen not just to destroy, but to rebuild. In the aftermath, the fall of Richard Langford was swift and absolute. Stripped of his wealth and facing a mountain of federal charges, he became a pariah. The media, once his tool, turned on him with feral glee, chronicling every detail of his disgrace. His empire was dismantled, its corrupt pieces sold off under Andre's meticulous supervision. Andre, however, took no pleasure in watching his enemy's ruin. His focus was on the monumental task he had set for himself, the resurrection of two broken companies, and the restoration of justice for thousands of forgotten workers. He took the helm of Aerocoast, not as a conqueror, but as a reformer. His first act was to establish a new, ironclad passenger Bill of Rights, the first of its kind in the industry, guaranteeing fair treatment for all customers. He then implemented a generous profit-sharing program, making every employee, from the baggage handlers to the pilots, a stakeholder in the airline's success. The culture began to shift from one of cynical indifference to one of shared purpose. His most important work, however, happened far from the public eye. He personally oversaw the restructuring of the Langford Pension Fund, using the proceeds from the liquidation of Langford's assets. Combined with a significant portion of his own fortune, he stabilized the fund and secured the retirement of every last worker. He flew to Baltimore and held a town hall in the shadow of the old Garrison steel mill, explaining to the wary, skeptical retirees that their futures were now safe. For the first time in decades, he saw hope return to the eyes of the people he had grown up with. The news cycle moved on, but the impact of Andre's victory continued to ripple outward. Inspired by his model of restorative capitalism, other corporations began to re-examine their own practices. The man who had been publicly humiliated for demanding his rightful seat had become a global icon of ethical leadership. A few months after the shareholder meeting, a simple, handwritten letter arrived at Andre's office. It had no return address, but the postmark was from a small, unassuming town in Vermont. He opened it. "Mr. Coleman, you don't know me, but my name is Sarah Langford. Richard Langford is my father. I have not spoken to him in over 15 years. I am writing to thank you. For my entire life, I have watched my father's greed and bitterness poison everything he touched. He was haunted by my grandfather's ghost, and he spent his life trying to become a bigger, more ruthless version of him, believing that was the only way to erase the shame. You did not just expose a criminal. You broke a generational cycle of toxicity and pain. You showed the world that true strength isn't about domination, but about responsibility. By saving the pensions of those workers, you honored my grandfather's victims in a way my father never could. I know this may offer little comfort, but please know that you have given at least one member of the Langford family a chance at peace. Thank you for showing that it is possible to win without destroying everything in your path. Sincerely, Sarah. Andre read the letter twice, a profound sense of closure washing over him. He had sought revenge, but in the end, he had found something far more meaningful: redemption. Not just for himself, but for a history of pain that stretched back decades. 1 year to the day after the shareholder meeting, Andre stood on a patch of barren, weed-choked land in Baltimore. The rusted skeleton of the Garrison steel mill loomed behind him, a monument to a bygone era. But he wasn't looking at the past. He was looking at the future. He stood beside the mayor and a group of community leaders. Between them, on an easel, were the architectural blueprints for a new building. Today, we break ground on the Coleman Center for Technology and Innovation. Andre announced to the crowd of local residents and reporters, this facility, built on the grave of an industry that left this community behind, will provide free education, job training, and startup incubation for the next generation of innovators. We are not just building a structure. We are rebuilding a foundation. He looked out at the faces in the crowd. He saw the children of the steelworkers his father had known. He saw the hope, the possibility, the journey that had begun with a public humiliation at a gala, that had been forged in the fire of a confrontation at 30,000 feet, had led him back here, to the place where it all began. He hadn't just defeated his enemy. He had used his victory to heal the original wound, to turn a site of loss into a source of opportunity. His revenge was complete. It wasn't the scorched earth victory he had once craved. It was better. It was the quiet, unshakable triumph of building something new and hopeful from the ashes of the old.